So the title for the talk today is Big Data, Human Development and Valuing Voices. And what we want to focus on is the work of Africa's Voices Foundation, and look at it both from the point of view of attempts at innovation in this space of data and voice and human development, but also some of the ethical challenges that arise with this kind of work. Really would love this to be an opportunity to hear from you as to what you think are some of the best and worst features of what you hear about we're up to. And I think this is really much a work in progress for us, and so some of the things that we're wrestling with at the moment we'll be talking about and hoping to find out if you have any insights as to how we might address some of the challenges in this space. So I'll start off, introduce the project, where it came from, its genesis, why we came to what has become increasingly a bit of a big data a related project, but never started that way at all. And then I'll turn over to Claudia to talk in a bit more depth about the research and the approach we take to analysis, a couple of case studies of the work we've done to date, and then we'll end together talking about issues around ethics and how we approach and treat data. Great. I'm going to start though with something a bit different than what we do. This is a quote that comes from a Lewis Carroll story. So this is a Sylvie and Bruno series, and comes right at the end. Sylvie and Bruno concluded The Man in the Moon. And it relates a story where a sort of an alien or someone from another planet visits, and called Mein Herr, which is obviously nicely named. And he talks about the things that they've learnt from humans and the things that they've perfected and done better than humans have done. And he talks about map making. He says, well, we've carried it much further than you have. So what do you consider the largest map that would be really useful? And Sylvie says, 6 inches to the mile. He says, that's nothing, we've done that ages ago. We soon got to 6 yards to the mile, then we tried 100 yards to the mile, and then we came up with the greatest idea of all. We actually made it to a map of the country on the scale of a mile to the mile. And he's asked, have you used it much? It's like, well, no, it's never been spread out yet because the farmers, were concerned that it would cover the country and the crops would die. They said that they instead now use the country itself as a map, and I assure you it does nearly as well. So it's this wonderful sort of story in which the perfection of this thing, which is the map, is taken to a degree that it becomes the world itself or reality itself. And then this sort of nice inversion that actually, why don't we use reality as a very good map of reality itself? There's something in that, there's a more serious version of the very same idea that's used by Jorge Luis Borges, the Latin American magic realist, and who does some wonderful work thinking about some of the quandaries of sciences. And he talks about an ancient empire far away. The art of cartography attained such perfection that the map of a single province occupied the entirety of a city, the map of the empire, the entirety of a province. And in time, those unconscionable maps no longer satisfied, and the Cartographers' Guild struck a map of the empire whose size was that of the empire, which coincided point for point with it. And then they realized that this vast map again was very useless, and it ended up tattered in ruins in the corner of the globe. Now, obviously, both of these stories share a lot in common, this quest for exactitude, in one sense, for completeness, for reality to be, to come in a shape and form that is as perfect a version of the reality itself. And of course, the point of this is that at some point, the quest for completeness defeats the very virtues of representation, and that actually a lot of what we try to do is do representation. We try to take aspects of social reality or the reality out there, the physical reality, and bring it together in forms, in symbols, in arrangements that represent that reality and are useful to us. One of the challenges, I think, with big data is that we start to lose sight of this role of what is being represented, what's the thing itself, what's being represented, and how is what is being represented being interpreted. Those classic stages that are very much involved in any other form of assemblage of knowledge as a way of understanding reality, starts to lose focus of it, because this idea that more and better and faster data becomes a comprehensive form of this reality that we can analyse as if it is the reality itself, and form understanding from it, without heeding the fact that it is, as data, only a representation of something, partial, incomplete, and that it requires forms of interpretation in order to understand it carefully, and being transparent and making visible what is and isn't included in the data, and making transparent and visible the processes through we interpret this kind of data is very, very, very important. So with that, let me just say something about this project and its origins. It started as a research project into new communication technologies in sub-Saharan Africa, and in particular the role that they played in new spaces for citizen engagement in governance processes, public debate, public discussion, and processes of development. And that was a project called Politics and Interactive Media in Africa, which was a DFID and ESRC funded project. That was primarily concerned in-depth case study research in Zambia and Kenya, and we focused on broadcast media, and in particular interactivity through broadcast media, mobile phones, and how they were enabling people to engage, discuss, call in shows, send text messages, to radio shows, and also to broadcast TV. And this research took place intensively in 2012, 2013. But alongside it, we were also interested in whether these new spaces of engagement were opening up possibilities for other forms of interaction, for them not to just be ephemeral and to disappear there and then in these talk-in shows and call-in shows, etc., but to be forms of interaction that could sustain discussion of public issues, understanding of public issues through those who contribute. Could there be new forms of public opinion, etc., that could be gathered through these kinds of spaces, and what sort of significance would it have? And so that linked with another more applied research project which had similar and parallel origins called Africa's Voices. And this was a pilot project, really shoestring budget, and we were just thinking about, well, if you connected up these different conversations that go on in interactive radio shows around the continent, and if they were around similar themes, could you start to see how audiences were talking about similar themes in different ways, in different places? And so what we did is ran a very basic pilot, but in an experimental mode. So we're trying to learn about how these sorts of shows tick and what makes people participate, why they engage, and why they value these shows, and how might that be used in order to sustain forms of engagement on local language radio stations. So we ran a pilot in 8 different countries, a range of stations in different countries, very local, most of them. Oh, that ticked along. Very, very local, most of these stations. And we sought to ask questions on common themes, ranging from environment to health, to governance questions, and see if the audience is engaged and what we could learn about the processes of engagement. Now, there's lots that we could talk about in terms of the detail of the pilot and what we gathered, but I want to just emphasize a few things that came out. The really obvious thing about these shows is that when they're valued by audiences, they're valued because they're engaging, they're interesting, they like to hear people like them with offering their views on these shows. They're interested in the presenters and the way that presenters mediate these sorts of discussions. And that this is a social space in a way. It's a convened space, it's a mediated space, but it's a social space. And audience members value it for that. And that's critical to the engagement that is made possible. So in thinking about some of the things that the pilot revealed to us, just a few main thoughts. One was around engagement versus extraction, which is to say that these spaces were valued social spaces, and they mattered because the kind of engagement strategy was engaging. When we asked questions in which there was a sort of like, just tell us yes or no, don't or offer a multiple choice set of options, that's not very engaging for an audience member to contribute their view because it limits their voice. If they were allowed to sort of express themselves and say why and give justifications for what they thought, and often feel free as well along the way to greet the presenter, the radio presenter, or greet a family member and say other things. They would do that because this was a social space. So the more extractive the approach to these kinds of spaces, the less likely they are, in a sense, to sustain themselves. Related to that is this issue of anonymity and recognition. So from the point of view of potentially the station or a researcher or others who want to engage with these spaces, the anonymity of the participant matters a great deal for a range of very, very important reasons. But as I said, because this is a social space of engagement, often people want to be recognized. Their contribution is because they hope they might be read out on air. And they want to also note who they are, what village they're from, and as I said, often greet a family member or a friend. So there's a tension there between how we think about the social significance of raising a voice versus the data concerns that relate to data protection and security that come from a recognition at the same time. And the third point was around unique voices and aggregation, which was that what makes this a rich space is because people have individual unique voices. It's not because you're arranging them across a distribution and putting them as data points that allow you to come up with some aggregate statistical measure. And so how do you nevertheless come up with forms of knowledge that are in effect in aggregate, that draw from this kind of data and are able to discern patterns and sort of things of significance, but maintain that valuing of these unique voices at the same time? That for us was some of the key challenges that led to a sort of underlying ethos of an organization that would try to navigate them in the most relevant ways. And I would just say that what struck us when I think back about this thing about big data is that you wouldn't necessarily go to a local language radio station in a distant regional part of a sub-Saharan African country and work with that local language and unstructured text data that comes into the radio station. If you were interested in just gathering lots of data as quick and best as you could, you'd probably try to link up some social media channel, some process that involved sort of mobile phones and PDAs that didn't have to be mediated through radio shows. Extractive processes would actually choose far more efficient and simple affordances that come from direct digital access, in a sense. But actually, if you take the view that you want to include and engage a broad and difficult to reach and difficult to hear swathe of the population, these kinds of more challenging channels are nevertheless far more valuable and enriching. So that's a sort of a whistle-stop tour of where the background to Africa's voices came from. And for us, now you probably can't read, you can't read that, so I'm going to move on. There is the blog on the Oxford Institute's big data and development website has an interesting schematic of the kinds of challenges that are faced in big data and human development. And I think they're similar to the ones that we're wrestling with, so we thought it was really relevant to be at this seminar series today. So from that pilot and all of that, we ended up spinning out an organization, Africa's Voices Foundation, that is a non-profit charity, still connected closely to Cambridge researchers and to us, but is an independent organization that allows us to draw on everything we've done, massively expand the kind of technical and other know-how that can make this kind of work possible. And it's a research service organization primarily, so we're serving organizations interested in social development outcomes in Africa and assisting them with ways of, as we say, listening intelligently to the voices of African citizens. It's a year old, a year and a bit old, I guess, as a charity. It's been a really exciting and bumpy year, but really, really exciting. And I think we've come a long way, and some of that you'll hear from Claudia today. So what do we do at Africa's Voices Foundation? We first is we reach remote, diverse, and unique communities. And this sounds a bit simplistic, but really, starting with the design around social research and social citizen and social engagement is very different than starting with something around data. And so you start with the design around what are the channels of engagement that will matter to reach the citizens you're interested in reaching, and very much still work with local language radio, but move with the times. It's not we're not driven by the interactive radio format only, and certainly moved to social media when it comes to youth in Kenya and South Africa and other places where if you want to engage, it's radio is old school. But the idea of reach is really, really important, and that relates to engagement. I think once reached through channels, then the question is, well, what's the design around engagement that really can work best to reach target communities? This is a non-trivial point, because one of the things we found with radio is that if you, in our other research, the standard proportion of male to female participation in interactive shows on radio is about 80-20, 80% male, 20% female. But where engagement is an art, and it's where shows are designed in particular ways to encourage the voices of different parts of the population to be heard, that can trigger very different changes in these sort of patterns of participation. So if this is a social space, if we think of these as convened social spaces, then things like interactive radio shows, who's convening, who feels that they have a voice and a place to participate versus just to listen, who doesn't? It's very much a social design question rather than just engagement, switch it on, do they have a phone, make it free, rationally they will participate. No, this is about sort of the social determinants of participation, sociality, as we think about it in aspects of thinking about the public sphere. Very similar concepts and relevant to these spaces. So we found that engagement and thinking about designing for engagement is critical. We deliver collaborative interactive media projects, so very much the sort of practical side of actually seeing these projects through with partners that we work with. And of course, most importantly, our focus here today is on how we analyse audience opinions using diverse textual techniques, and we'll come to that in a second. And finally, how we amplify those using visual and engaging reports. So that's the kind of way we think about our ethos and what we're about and how we work. I'll hand over to Claudia to say a little bit more about all of that.
Thank you, Sharath. So the way that we work at Africa Voices, we work with client organizations that are development organizations operated in East Africa mainly. And we, along these lines of reaching, engaging and delivering, analysing and amplify voices of citizens, we have different platforms of engagement with citizens. So we start with the radio, that's what we did in our pilot, and now we are starting engaging citizens through social media, through Facebook and WhatsApp groups. So in these media forums, we just don't collect data in a passive way. We shape these forums in a way that we put questions so people can answer and engage in forums that we think are meaningful for them and will produce good quality data and good quality insights for our client organizations. And so how it works, for example, in the radio station, is that these spaces are already there, the interactive radio shows, and we work with the radio presenters and some media partners just to develop scripts for radio shows that will maximize the engagement and the interest from audiences. And in these scripts, we ask always one question, so to give opportunity for people to reply using their mobile phones to a number that is owned by Africa Voices, that is a toll-free number. And this is the way that we reach people. So we reach audiences. We start with no knowledge about these audiences, and we build this knowledge as with the radio shows happen. So they send us messages with their opinions, and this will happen a channel of communication between us and them. So the first step is understand who they are. So we ask the questions about what's your gender, age, and location to do a sort of audience analysis that is also valuable for our media partners and especially the radio stations. And then we can, with this channel of open, we can ask them questions that can be tailored to the topics of the radio shows. So we combine the organic data that it flows naturally during radio shows that we can gather with some more tailored SMS surveys with more systematic and quantitative type questions, especially in terms of yes, no, and questions that can be easily coded, just to link to the information that we have of the opinions of citizens. And we use a digital platform to do this. So every time that audience member send a text message to our number, this will be gathered in a digital platform that we can think of social media, but we can think with SMS. We work with different partners with these digital platforms. It's not our digital platforms. It's a platform that we get from a partner. For example, when we work with UNICEF, there's a platform that is Rapid Pro, that is their own platform. Or when we work in Kenya, usually use EcoMobile. And then with data in the platform, we download the data and we do our own analysis. So the way that we analyze the data is not extractive, as Sharath said, and we don't want to quantify voices of people. We want to give the richness enough in our analysis so we can gather what people are saying about these topics as a collective group. So it's not counting ads and counting how many people agree or disagree with our question, but is what people think about it. So we call it collective beliefs, because it has to do with the representations, the ideas about the reality that you want to gather. And we do this in local languages. So we have minimum interference in the format of the audience interactivity. So if they interact with the radio station in their local languages using their, as Sharath mentioned, like greeting audiences, greeting other members or the presenters, or sending some type of messages, we gather all this and we analyze using techniques that we develop in-house to analyze big, messy textual data. It's not always big, because sometimes we do some pilots, we work with radio stations that are more community local radio stations where people don't engage in large volumes of data. But it's big data in the sense that it's messy and structured with African languages, that sometimes with several languages in the same data set. And then we analyze these collective beliefs, and we analyze them, interpret them in terms of actionable insights that will be useful for the organizations that we are working with. And we have some concern of giving the data back to the community as well. So not only getting the data from them, but giving them back our insights.
Which is pretty challenging.
It's very challenging, yes. We have started thinking about it. Yes. So the way that we do the analysis is combining data science with more sophisticated techniques of data mining or data analysis, but also with social sciences framework. It's not that we start with the data and we apply machine learning just to see what comes out of the data. We start with our own frameworks as researchers to test hypotheses with this data. And we look at the data from an insider perspective. So we work with native speakers. Some of the native speakers. Sorry. Some of the native speakers are they have some research background, but they understand what is important is the context of where this data was generated and the context of the language and nuances of meanings, metaphors, jokes. Sarcasm. So we interpret the data in this very iterative way. So we work with data scientists, with local researchers, and as University of Cambridge researchers, just to make sense of this data in this very interdisciplinary, multivariate way. In terms of exactly the way that we do the analysis, I summarize here in 4 steps. These steps vary depending on the type of data and the type of research questions we are answering. But the first step is parsing the data. So as I said, the data is very messy. Even when we ask questions that are very easy to answer, are you a male or a female? People can say, I'm a mother of 2 children. So we have our own scripts, so we can process this data and parse them in categories that are meaningful for presentation. And we explore the messages, opinions of people with an interface that we develop as Africa Voices Foundation. That this is a screenshot of the interface. It's too populated, but basically what I want to show is that we have the messages here on the right side. So we can, when we analyze the data, we are always in this permanent contact with the data. That's testing hypotheses about, for example, lexicon, how people talk about for example, polio in Somalia, and we look at the words that people are using for polio. And this interface is based on an algorithm that is a co-occurrence. So when we search by one word, for example, polio in Somali, that is dabayesha, dabayel, we can look at other words that are associated with it, for example, wind. And then we see what are the first clusters of meanings of these seed words with other words through these co-occurrence networks. And we do this with the native speakers because it's the only way that we can give some meaning to the data. But we cannot scale up this methodology and look at all the data. So we have the first look at the data to understand what are the most prominent topics in the data, and then we develop some lexicon around like the words that are associated in different topics, and then we use some machine learning techniques just to apply the same rules that we found with native speakers to the rest of the data. And so we have a training set that is, we can apply the rules to see how reliable, efficient the algorithm will be based on the validation by the native speaker. So after we create these rules, we put this in the machine learning with the algorithm, and then we look at the outputs and see how valid the outputs are, and then we improve the algorithm. So we're doing these machine learning techniques when we have enough data, because sometimes the projects are very small and we can do it manually using more qualitative techniques. So now I'm going to give you 3 examples of the work that we do. So this is a pilot that we did last year, a very small pilot in Uganda around maternal health. So this pilot was part of a research that was undergoing at University of Cambridge to understand what are the cultural drivers of maternal health and maternal mortality, because Uganda is one of the countries in the world with the highest level of maternal mortality, and there we work with researchers at University of Cambridge with a more medical science background who are studying the preeclampsia among Ugandan mothers. And we, as researchers from Africa Voices, work with them to understand what are the cultural drivers that can explain higher levels of mortality in Uganda, besides the lack of health facilities and probably some genetic factors. So we set up radio shows in 4 different radio stations. As I said, this was a very small pilot. It was a pilot we did for 4 weeks in 4 radio stations in central Uganda, mainly in Kampala.
We were pretty much just testing whether this could be a viable method, isn't it, as much as anything else?
Yes, yeah. Yes. And so we use different radio stations just to improve our methods and to pilot some methods of engagement with population. So the different radio stations, we knew that they were reaching different types of audiences. For example, more urban audiences in Luganda language. All the stations are in Luganda stations, but more young urban audiences or more rural audiences and people maybe stations where the level of engagement was not very high. And we work with the presenters just to strengthen this method of getting messages from citizens just to understand their opinions about preeclampsia or high blood pressure, problems during pregnancy and delivery. And so people engage using mobile phones. They react to some scenarios. So in different weeks across these 4 radio stations per week, we had some scenarios about real life situations of women who had preeclampsia, and some of them with happy endings, others not really. And we asked them questions about what do the people think that caused the situation of these mothers. And we asked this in a different ways. We can ask directly, what do you think was the cause of her problem? Or we can ask, what do you think people in your community would say about it? Or for example, what will be the advice that you give to young mothers and pregnant mothers not to go through the same situation? So as social researchers, we just apply different ways that people can think about an individual or a group self and about cultural norms, just to get the information that you want from people. That is, what are the collective beliefs about causes and complications during pregnancy. So we did the data analysis using the combination of data of SMS exploration with machine learning, more sophisticated techniques, just to scale up the insights that we found in the data through our interface. And most of the messages were in Luganda. We had some messages in Swahili or in English, but we developed our own language resources to analyze Luganda. We do this every time we do a project. So when we work with the native speakers, just to, for example, code the data about the social demographics, we are building some knowledge about the language that we store. When every time that you do a project in a different language, we will do it so it can be applied to future projects. So this is the first time that we did some analysis in Luganda. So the project, the analysis was very focused on creating these language resources. In terms of the results of the engagement, we are very pleased to see that we reach not many people. So in terms of the total number of people, we received like 4,462 messages from 2,000 people, but half of those 2,000 were women. We had 49.6% of female messages compared to 50.4% of males. So we know from other projects that this is a very good outcome in terms of the quality of engagement. Probably the topic helped, but the fact that in some stations we are using female presenters who were already a very positive reputation among their audiences, and where they were engaging women already, it helped to give this quality of engagement. And in terms of age group, that's not much to say. We know that there's young people are more likely to engage in these radio shows, but you also get voices from older age groups. And geographically, we are able to map what are the regions in Uganda where most of these voices are coming from, and of course they are in Kampala and outskirts of Kampala, because that's the radio station's reach that we use. So what we did with the data was to organize the data, the opinions of people, into collective beliefs, into what people think that are the causes of complications during pregnancy. And we had like 60 different themes that we came up with, different themes that we came up by exploring the data with our interface. And then we could see that the most prevalent themes in our data, people said that this woman had problems because of delays in seeking healthcare. That it's obvious from the script, but they can explain why people delay seeking healthcare in terms of the low quality of professionals, like the expectations of mother, that maybe they were not treated very well in the hospitals or health centers. Or some other psychological concerns that are more to be with fear, health professionals, or fear going to, for example, antenatal checkups. So it's a denial from the mother because of these expectations and what they think that they will have if they go to a hospital. And there's also a very common theme among men and women, that was the relationship with husband, has to do some kind of practices, cultural practices, that husband sometimes leaves home when the woman is pregnant, and so it leaves the woman in a state of fragility, psychological and also financial fragility. So if there's any problem with the pregnancy, she will be less likely to reach an hospital, probably because she needs someone to take her there, or maybe she needs to pay for the fees of the bus to go to the hospital. So if the husband leaves home, it could be one of the, people believe that is one of the causes of problems, the high blood pressure, especially because the woman is more stressed, and maybe it needs to do the house chores, and sometimes to work with the family of the husband and still doing things for them, and without the help of the husband that the woman used to have. And there are some people who say that has to do with like biological and genetical factors. So after we identified these beliefs, we group them into the locus of causality. So some of these beliefs are related with the characteristics of the mother, others are related to the for example, the government, when they are talking about the low quality of professionals and the lack of health centers. They can talk about husbands or others, or they can talk about supernatural, like religious beliefs, the fact that women maybe didn't pray enough, or the fact that maybe there was some witchcraft, from a neighbor. So I'm going to present just some examples of when people talk about the cause to be the woman. Is, for example, I have just lost my baby because I went to the hospital when it is 5 months and they checked for my blood pressure and it was high, but the cause for the miscarriage was due to stressing on my side. Or some women eat a lot when pregnant, which makes them lazy in the end. It means like in terms of delivering the baby. Or for example, I think the problem is using family planning drugs when she was still young. So we identify for each one of the topics some subtopics that women are talking about. And then why we analyze this in terms of locus of causality is just to test an hypothesis that there's in psychology, there's an actor-observer difference. Is a kind of error of attribution that people, actors, tend to attribute the behavior of others to internal causes in terms of personality, in terms of biology, in terms of motivation or willingness to do something. While if an actor tends to attribute his or her own behavior to more situational factors. For example, the fact that in this particular case, the fact that a mother thinks that it's not about her being careless, but the fact that maybe the doctors, they were not very professional, or the fact that they don't have like very good conditions that in terms of healthcare. So we test that maybe women, the pregnant woman or the woman who interact with the radio show, they tend to talk more about causes related to others, related to the government, or to the husband, for example, while men, they tend to talk more about causes related to the woman, things about her personality, things that you cannot change easily, like, oh, this is a careless woman, for example. And so we found some evidence for this. So we found that men are more likely than women to attribute causes to the mother biology of genetics. So they are 23% more likely to attribute the causes to the mother biology genetics as compared to women. And the mother's negligence or direct poverty or witchcraft, while women are more likely than men to attribute the causes to the mother's lifestyle. That is, the causality is the woman, but it's something the woman can change. It's not something that is internal, dispositional. Or the low quality of the professionals or violence of abuse from the husband or others, and the lack of religiosity. And then this was the analysis of the collective beliefs, of the opinions that people sent to the radio shows, but then we link them to the survey. So every week we ask one different question. For example, in one of the weeks we ask, do you think this problem, this preeclampsia, could have happened to you or to your wife? And we wanted to evaluate the perception of risk about this type of problems. And we realized that the gender of the respondent was related to this perception of risk. So men don't think that this problem could have happened to them or to their wives. Only 18% said yes, compared to women that 45.9% said yes, this could have happened to me. So because maybe husbands, they think that they have healthy wives and they are looking after them, this is not going to be a problem for them because their wives is not the type of woman will get problems during pregnancy, while women have a more broader understanding about these problems and understanding that there's a multitude of factors in the environment that can affect the fact that they will have problems during pregnancy. So in terms of what the key insights that we can get from this research, apart from the substantive insights, is that we learn and what are the methodological challenges and what are the conditions that will maximize the engagement, the meaningful engagement of these audiences through radio. And in terms of the substantive insights. We understood what are the different ways, the different causes that people think that are related to problems during pregnancy, and there was like this gender difference that men tend to focus more on these internal causes related to the biology and the medical conditions of the mother, while the mother tend to focus more on the low quality of professionals and the relationship with her husbands. So I think as a key learning for us was to understand that this type of methodology can be used to shape context-specific interventions in terms of health. And we have plans to scale it up with other projects in Uganda and beyond Uganda to other countries. So now I'm going to present you another very short case study. I'm presenting shortly, but it's a very important case study for us, Africa Voices. We just finished a project with UNICEF Somalia to understand what are the misconceptions about routine immunization, such as polio and measles in Somalia, and maternal and child health. So we use the same methodology that we had pilot in Uganda and we apply to a very fragile, insecure environment such as Somalia, and we work with a media partner, Free Press Unlimited, to have radio shows in 20 different radio stations across the country. So the reach coverage was total. So we reach people in the areas where the radio stations were located, in South Central and Puntland, Somalia. And we use the same methodology. We had 8 radio shows. Every week we asked different questions on air. We had a script that was sometimes related with polio vaccination, sometimes was related with baby health or delivering in the hospital, and we had some guests. We had some health experts from UNICEF, and we have some medical doctors from Hargeisa, and also we have one sheikh in the studio, in one of the shows. And in terms of engagement was very good. We received more than 12,000 messages from over 8,000 people, and in a language that we didn't have also resources to analyze it. So we had to we need to explore the data with a native speaker. So we work always with translators, and in this case we work with a researcher that was a Somali researcher who was sitting with us in Cambridge in our office. So in terms of the method, what is different in terms of the research is like we always start with designing the research in terms that it will be rigorous for us as a researcher then to take conclusions. So we wanted to understand how women who vaccinate or parents who vaccinate and don't vaccinate the children differ, or women who deliver or not in the hospital, for example, differ in terms of not only social demographic profile, but in terms of the perceptions of risk of, for example, getting polio, or in terms of their knowledge about polio and vaccination, and more broadly about their beliefs and attitudes about vaccination and about healthcare. So this is just to show you that our spread, so we even that we didn't work in Somaliland, we received a few messages because we had a radio station in Bari, right at the corner, that was Puntland. And here there are some examples of messages that we received. For example, here there is polio due to water and poor hygiene because the roads are filled with water, or pregnant women should not visit health facilities because it's a recipe to contract other diseases. Or here is mostly polio, that is a disease which has made many children disabled. We are ready to fight for it. And lastly, traditional medicine, that was also very frequent in the messages, that traditional medicine is good because our Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, has told us to use traditional medicine such as honey, black cumin, and others to treat some illnesses. Again, we had a very good engagement in terms of gender ratio. We have 44% of participants were women, and it didn't change from week to week. So this was a kind of stable audience that we had. So every week we would gathering more people, but we had like some audience that was sending messages over the 8 different weeks. And for us was a very good learning experience, because we had 8 radio shows, but in the the last 3 radio shows, we realized that engagement was going up, was increasing 5 times. So we understood that this type of radio shows, they takes a while until they will take off and start engaging more and more people. So for us was not, it started as a pilot, but then I think it's a big project in terms of the reach and the quality of the engagement. And because we are working with UNICEF, so when we analyze this data, especially the quantitative data from the survey, some questions that they wanted to know that are related with their indicators. For example, what's the percentage of parents who vaccinate their children in each region it's important for them for their situational analysis, or if there's differences about how men and women prefer to be reached in terms of health information. So we create some interactive dashboards and we work with them so they could interact with it. They can, for example, combine to see, what's a man who lives in a rural area, what will be the probability that will vaccinate their children, and then see how this varies across regions, for example. So we just finished this project very recently. And I think in terms of what we can take from the project is that we identify some beliefs that people have, especially around cleanliness, that they associate, for example, polio with the idea that has to be with hygiene and to live in clean environments, such as clean hair. Like, for example, people in rural areas, they are less prone to get polio because they have a good milk and good hair. And as well, because some people, they think that by praying and by living in communities where they are 100% Muslims, this will prevent them to get polio. So it's the idea of cleanliness that is hygiene and also spiritual cleanliness. And finally, if you still have some time. Yeah.
Should I do this one if you want?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, very quickly, this is the last example we're going to raise, and I won't go into too much detail. This is it's different because the scale of the data that we analyze is much larger. We don't do the engagement. This is an organization called Well Told Story that is an Emmy Award-winning social media organization in Kenya and works in Tanzania as well, and reaches a huge number of Kenyan and now Tanzanian youth using its Well Told Story, which is a story about a DJ called DJ B who has a pirate radio station and sort of engages Kenyan youth on issues that matter to them, and the station's called Shujaz FM. So they're very, very successful as an organization. This is about 1.5 years ago, it's grown since as well, but 1.5 million comics per month that they print and that recirculate as well, so the readership is much larger than that. And this DJ B, who again about a year and a bit ago had about 1 million Facebook likes, probably has a hell of a lot more now. And they reach a very, very large number of their target population. It was estimated using survey work they did of about 5.7 million Kenyan youth between the ages of 15 and 24. And that was sort of early last year. And so there's the comics, the physical print comics, but they've got a lot of social media presence, and they're really moving towards a digital platform now as well. And they also use radio. So they came to us because they engaged their fan base very actively, DJB as the engaging counterpart, using SMS through the comics, like a free SMS, and then using social media as well. And the fan base contacts DJB and he sometimes replies them, and that's very exciting for them. But they had this challenge which they were basically had got hundreds of thousands of SMSs from their fan base, and were wondering could they actually learn from that what's making their audience tick, because one of the key things about how they work is to really understand how young people are talking about and thinking about issues, and then pull that into the narrative of their comics and their characters. So they really have to sort of be close to the pulse of how young people think. So we got this huge number of SMS. Finally, in the ultimate analysis, 620,000 SMS that we were analysing in this project. Very different to what we were doing before. We weren't doing the engagement, but we were helping them think about how they could analyse these messages. These messages come often in Swahili, sometimes in English, but very often with Sheng, so the slang language that's used, mixture of Swahili, English, and that. So the messages are coming in unstructured text message in Sheng. Very, very difficult to use any traditional techniques to analyze that data. In this particular level of analysis, we had to There was 442,000 at that point of SMS that we analysed from 90,000 different individuals. And a lot of the process was just about cleaning this kind of data set so you can actually do something useful with it. And I wouldn't go into the detail of that here now, but that actually was probably the most important starting point, was that we developed these resources for cleaning this data and organising it so that it could be tagged with socio-demographic data and made useful to the next stage of analysis. So just gives a quick sense of that. And again, we sort of presented them with sort of audience insights about what's the target, how they were doing with it, in reaching the target population that they were seeking to engage. The sort of other sort of statistics around, like, so the average duration in terms of the engagement in days that they would, from a message they originally received from an audience member to the final message. So the ways in which we could just use that very basic data, but not basic, but that data set, and do some basic analysis that, you know, were around age, gender, duration of engagement, etc., that was useful to them to understand patterns of engagement from their key demographic base. And this has also allowed us to do sort of geographic sort of analysis of the distribution of their audience base. More importantly, though, of course, we wanted to get into the content of this Sheng data. And this is just a rough sense of how we were, again, in a very structured framework, analyze this data using this sort of approach, then the data science on the one hand, how we're managing the data, and then also the human knowledge on the other hand, which in this case is language and knowledge of the language, working with them and researchers working at Will Tell Story to be able to understand, young people in effect, who understand this language and can help us to clean it, take out stop words and messiness, find the lexicons that matter, and then enable us to do the analysis. And this is just one of the examples. I don't know if should I actually move to the
Yes,
other? Yeah. So this is just one example of how we then start to form. Do you want to talk about the
Yes.
Yeah.
So we start with a word, for example, bol, that means pregnant in Sheng. And then we look at what are the words that are associated with bol. So when we filter out all the stop words, for example, we have it's like matoi, that is baby, children, or halihepa, that means runaway, or condom, CD, that is the short for condom, protection and unprotected. So we start finding clusters of meanings of messages that talk about girls whose boyfriends ran away when they were pregnant, or about some questions and some doubts about raising children, or about how can they protect using condoms, they can protect themselves during sex to avoid being pregnant. And there are some just examples of one message. For example, I made a mistake and I got pregnant. It was hard to make my boy understand that this is pregnancy, especially my boy ran away and they heard I am pregnant. I gave birth and the kid is 1 year, 8 months. So these are like very personal stories that people tell to DJB, and they expect to have a reply in return, and they do. So this is the type of engagement is a very sustainable engagement. There are people who are communicating with DJB for more than 2 years.
And I think one of the things is that, you know, the narratives of the comics are encouraging a discussion around the issues, and so if they're communicating with the DJ, that's because this is an issue that sort of matters to them and they're engaging with it. So what we were just in effect showing is that over time, when they introduce comics that have that language, is there a takeoff in the discussion that young people have with the characters around that topic? So that's sort of a word association of CD and ball, so condom and ball, and what's the pattern of discussion using those words over time, and have they managed to get a conversation going with young people around this topic?
Yes.
And then I guess the main thing, I'm going to quickly run ahead because of time, but the main thing that we were doing was saying what they wanted to know was that they had Gates Foundation funding, and the targets and expectations of the donor was, you know, you'll talk about contraception, you'll talk about implants, you'll talk about condoms, and you'll get a conversation going. And they wanted to say, well, look, we can't talk about those words because those words are not going to work with young people. We need to talk about a different language, and we don't know what that language is until we start talking to them. So how do you introduce measures and indicators of evaluating success when you don't really know what they are until you start the project, in effect? So they said, well, they did this. They spent a bunch of time using the formal language that was given to them under the project. And then their young researchers intuitively realized there's another conversation going on. It's other kinds of words. They're in Sheng. This is where we should shift the narrative. And they had done this by the time they came to us, but they were wondering, you know, can we show and demonstrate whether or not there was a take-up in the discussion when they moved their comic narrative to use the language that young people use themselves, basically. So this is kind of a, I don't know if it started, has it started? Or, you have started, okay. So this is basically what we were able to do with the lexicons. We create those two lexicons and then we run it back through the data set to show how does the slang lexicon and the formal language compare, like which one is more prominent in the messages that young people are using. And we were able to show over time that the slang lexicon basically takes off much more than the formal language. And so this was about engaging young people on their own terms. And when you map those two lines then against two sort of critical moments, the first moment is when they changed their comic themselves, not because of us, to reflect this language more in the comic, in the characters using the language of the audience, because they sort of intuited this. It did have a demonstrable effect on the use of the slang language, young people engaging in the conversation basically, much more than they did with the formal language. And then we did our analysis here and we sort of gave it to them and said, yep, you're right, you intuited this in the correct way. What more can you do with this? That's when in the second half you really see a tremendous increase as well. And part of that increase is to do with they've got a lot bigger engagement and the volume of messages is going up anyway. But even though that's the case, the ratio of the slang sort of language and discussion to the formal one took off dramatically. So it's just an interesting way of capturing the change in the conversation that they were able to introduce because they were listening, in a sense, intelligently to what and how young people were talking. So that's our last brief case study. And we've taken 54 minutes, and we might just take 3 minutes just to talk again, just finally about the ethical challenges of all of this, just to introduce them and then to get the discussion going, if that's all right.
Of course, of course.
Yes, so in terms of ethics, we abide by some integrity of data and data ethics that includes having a data protection and privacy policy, that the way that we do the analysis and we gather data is just respecting anonymity of participants. So we delete personal references as possible from the data, such as names, and we also we transform the numbers, the phone numbers, so we can work with them as an ID, but it's impossible just to get the number.
So the numbers you saw before in the interface, for example, are not actually phone numbers; they're sort of
transformed, hacked, And then the way that we store the data in our own servers, with encrypt data, protecting by passwords. And when we are working with the radio presenters, that they need to access the messages, so to read out the messages during the radio shows, we have different levels of privacy, that levels of access. So they when access the messages, they don't see the phone numbers, they only see the messages. So the phone numbers will be always possible to see the first step that we download data just before we change them. We have a contingency plan and a risk assessment. So at the onset of each project, we look at what will be like the risks in terms of data leakage, and we have a threat model. So in case that this happen, what will be like the action to take. And the way
I must say that stuff is easy to write down on paper and very difficult to make sort of meaningful.
Yes. Exactly. And the way that we think about data ethics has also to do about whose voices we are gathering. So in development context, the responsible data, it's not only about security and encryption, but also to give voice to people and to think about who are people who are going to be included in our research and whose voices we are gathering, and to make sure that these voices from hard to reach populations, and they are reflected in the data and they're reflected in the insights that we give to our organizations that we are working with, because this will will have implications in terms of affecting their lives and the important decisions for them. Finally, in terms of final reflections, do you want to go together? So
we can just leave this up. We don't want to, but there is lots still that we're reflecting on and think about all the time. One of the things that I think is really challenging in this kind of space is that the kinds of knowledge that we're producing are very new, and the way that we think about what kind of knowledge it is, I think, is still very immature. And so one of the things that strikes me about the whole big data discussion is when you go to conferences and discussions around big data, and some very sophisticated approaches are being used to gather and analyze that data, especially social data, but not only. A lot of the way in which decisions are made about this data turns on visual representation of that data and the kinds of intuitions that the person looking at it can make from saying, oh, well, you know, this aligns with some background knowledge I have or some intuitions I have. They bring to that decision of what they take from the data a lot of untransparent and invisible frames of reference. And so the same thing is going on in the space we're in, where we're moving away, we're creating forms of knowledge that have not necessarily transparency and visibility around the processes of production. And so unlike, as much as we might critique survey methods and other methods that have been there in the past, the visibility and transparency around the methodology and the frameworks that lie behind it and the assumptions is much higher. It's much less so in these kinds of contexts. And that relates to a problem of sort of replicability and validity that results from these kinds of processes. Like, who could go out there and do the same thing again to produce the same knowledge or not that we produced, and thus test it and verify it? This becomes much harder. It's a general challenge, obviously. I guess interpretation and selection of data insights is related to that as well. So quickly, just a sense that these questions are still ones that we have no answers to, obviously. Should we end it there? I think we're wary of the time.
Thank you so much. Really, really interesting insights. So.